Full Throttle is a classic point-and-click adventure game by LucasArts from back when they actually made games. It's based around a rough and tough biker who's got to bail his gang, the Polecats, out of trouble after being framed for murder. All on account of this long-jawed bigwig, here voiced by Mark Hamill, wanting to turn the last motorcycle-making company in the country into producing the second most heinous thing imaginable: minivans. Being originally released in '95, it's since been touched up and resold by Double Fine, so before we get into anything else, let's start off with what's actually changed to warrant being called a remaster in the first place. Well, for starts, there's the obvious of actually being able to get the game running without having to faff about with some emulator or other outside program. Then there's having all the art assets being redrawn and upscaled for modern systems, with some point of view shots being adjusted compared to their original scenes, rather than being lazily drawn over in a one-to-one basis. It actually adds a lot of clarity and definition, which lets characters move more than a couple of pixels in the general vicinity of where a face should be to simulate talking during wider shots. All without sacrificing any of the original art style that they were going for, which looks great by the way, and it's definitely one of the better remaster treatments, at least visually, that I've seen. And while the old graphics have their charm, they haven't exactly aged gracefully in some spots. Fortunately, you can toggle between the classic and new redone art style at any time, and rather smoothly at that by hitting F1. Since the game originally released with a 4:3 aspect ratio, scenes have been painted in around the borders in the updated version to fill in the blanks, which have been fitted in well enough that they feel right at home and don't detract from any of the character close-ups either. Everything's customizable too, letting you swap between classic and new sound effects, music, voiceovers, and the visual style in the options menu. It also includes a commentary track by some of the original developers, including Tim Schafer himself, that, while a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the audio quality department, it's still pretty insightful and interesting to listen to. The adventure starts with a lengthy cutscene between our big bad, Adrian Rittberger, and his boss, Malcolm Corley, bickering over an upcoming shareholders meeting, where they're rudely interrupted when our protagonist makes his introduction by way of popping a sick jump off the boot of their car. It then pans over into an intro credit scene featuring ostentatious shots of our slick bike and you having a giggle mate at the bar, when the game's finally set in motion once the falling out results in the main character waking up inside of a rubbish bin. It's here we finally get control of Ben Throttle, a tough, no-nonsense, but likable bloke that has a very pragmatic way of solving all of his problems, usually resulting in use for on noun. And while he says he's above walking, he doesn't seem opposed to running when necessary, with the most absolute Chad stride I've ever seen in my life. Ben's also not what you'd exactly call a people's person.
Later, hopefully.
Outside our opener, the other main cast member we come to get familiar with is Maureen, or, as she puts it, just Mo if that's too hard for you. She's a helpful but quippy mechanic that'll be there to help out our bad lad Ben whenever he gets into trouble, for better or for worse, and serves as a pretty good foil to his more serious nature.
I prefer not to use it. What about you?
Same deal.
Then it's Ben and Mo forever, I guess.
Unfortunately, she's pretty much the only NPC you'll have any lengthy, meaningful conversations with as well. And while Ben's certainly more of a doing than talking kind of guy, it means there's not much beyond half a dozen characters to talk to. A couple being straight up optional, although they're usually comedic and fun enough to engage with, sometimes dropping silly references or funny dialogue.
Help me, Ben! You're my only hope!
Out of the ones you get to have an actual chat with, there's usually very little in the way of questions to ask to learn about them or the setting they inhabit, which is a shame since it only left me wanting to learn more about the world. Speaking of which, the world itself features about a dozen different locations, most of them being fairly small due to the 4:3 aspect ratio, which can serve to make interiors feel a bit cramped or even claustrophobic at times. Also, since most places consist of single-screened areas to explore, it took me a while to realize you can scroll over to a whole other zone in the junkyard by just walking to the right a bit. So, whoops. While there's some variety in the areas you visit, it still feels a bit reined in, not letting you really see the scope of what the world has to offer. Like being teased with the prospect of a cool cave temple that you never get to go inside of. Still, nearly everywhere you do get to go is relevant to the plot and has something you need to do or collect, so it's rare you're ever wasting your time at a dead end. As for the gameplay itself, it's the usual point-and-click affair, which is to say, you direct Ben around while scrubbing the screen with your cursor until it changes to indicate something you can interact with. Oftentimes it'll just be some background fluff that'll have Ben commenting about this or that, but it's just as likely to be something necessary to advancing the story. Do this until you've exhausted every verb on absolutely everything else, like any classic adventure game, before moving on to the next area to rinse and repeat. This time around, the choice of verbs come in the eyeball, tongue, fist, and foot variety. I really like the way the eyes and tongue bulge out of the skull whenever you hover over them. That's pretty metal. The original gameplay remains untouched, while the remastered version lets you use shift to highlight interactable objects to tell you what to click on. Let's be honest, that's basically easy mode. I really recommend you just stick with the tried and true pixel hunting method. Besides, it doesn't even highlight everything for you anyway, so you're still gonna have to go hunting for the very specific spots to transition between hub areas. Ben saying that he doesn't walk is further undermined since he'll do nothing but that towards objects. So you get the pleasure of getting to watch him leisurely stroll over to a very specific spot on the ground whenever you want to examine or interact with a person or item. Oh, and also, he's in such a rush to catch up and save his biker mates, yet he insists on collecting a bunch of parts for his motorcycle first, instead of just legging it over there when he moves at about 100 miles an hour on the overworld screen. You could have just jogged there and saved them already, Ben. What are you doing? Run! Jokes aside, I'm glad he can move this fast, or that you can double click to immediately enter and exit areas, else it would make the game drag a bit whenever you're required to backtrack someplace. As for the puzzles, they're a bit of a mixed bag. A good number are fairly straightforward and simple, or at the very least logical. There's only one instance where you actually have to combine or use multiple items from your inventory to figure out a solution, and it makes sense, although it's also the only time you use your lips for anything outside of talking.
I'm not putting my lips on that.
Then there's others that are just an exercise in frustration and pain, like the Destruction Derby, where it keeps cutting to Maureen telling you to quit faffing about and hurry up, which can give you the impression you're doing something wrong, when really you just have to figure out the convoluted puzzle involving the other cars. It also doesn't help that it keeps cutting to close-up shots, interrupting what you're doing and making the whole section take that much longer.
Get over here and nail me.
You can get advice from your former gang leader regarding a stunt ramp you need to retrieve, but I hope you were paying attention, cause Father Torque pisses off to never be seen again once you exhaust all of his dialogue. Mercifully, they include a visual and audio clue as to what you're meant to be doing with it later on, so it isn't quite so bad. Another puzzle pretty much requires brute forcing your way through it, since I understood what Maureen was trying to tell me regarding kicking a wall in the right spot at the right time, but there's so many cracks in the wall that made it pretty much impossible to figure it out logically, and it just evolved into guesswork and trying over and over until I got it right. The last section of the game is pretty awesome, with an intense confrontation, but it's undermined a little from just how trial and error its puzzles are. Since you're working on a time limit, and it has a bunch of plausible solutions, but it will flat out tell you they're wrong until you guess the right one it's thinking of. It's still a pretty intense and enjoyable set piece, all in all though, that I really enjoyed playing through. After all is said and done though, the worst offender by far has to be the mandatory combat sequences you get halfway through the game. The entire mine road area is a drag as you drive around on a railroad waiting to encounter other bikers. Good luck figuring out what beats who though, as the whole thing is pretty much rock paper chainsaw requiring specific weapons. So you've essentially got to pause your adventure game progress to instead start grinding for equipment. It also handles about as primitively as you'd expect of a Flash game, which I can't tell if that's appropriate or not, since this originally released before Flash was even a thing. You're doing all this tedious combat just so you can knock out one of these Tusken Raiders and get their special goggles. So you can then ride around on a different rail for about 2 minutes until you find the specific exit you need to take. This, combined with the fact that you can lose your weapon, requiring you to go back and fight people you've already beaten again, plus having a 20-second gap between each encounter just serves to waste your time. Sure, you can hit the skip button to avoid the next guy you're going to come across, but then you're still stuck waiting for another guy to show up. Seriously, if you're going to use a walkthrough, use it for this part and just save yourself the headache. Pretty much any other complaints I have pale in comparison to this. Like Ben occasionally moonwalking off screen, then having to go through the tedious adventure trope secret of talking to someone over and over again until they let you do something, which is a serious offender here since the dialogue doesn't even change, it just repeats the same line constantly until you do it enough times. And the payoff for doing this is basically nothing. Finally, the ending kinda just comes out of nowhere and feels a bit rushed, with a 2-minute cutscene and then cut to credits. Which, it isn't a terrible ending, just a bit underwhelming since the rest of the story was really enjoyable. The audio in the remastered version is a lot clearer, no longer sounding quite so muffled as it did in the original release.
So stuff your carcass in there quick and we might hit that mink dump by morning.
Hope you're better with a stick shift than you are with a knife.
Yeah.
And with the voice acting still sounding pretty great, adding a lot of distinct personality to each character.
Nothing big. I already pulled your bike out. It's sitting right over there.
One or two parts do sound out of place though, like they were awkwardly spliced together or something. Like when Ben dumps all of the now unnecessary weapons from the tedious fighting segment.
Those weapons were a lot of weight.
Besides this, the soundtrack is pretty good to listen to, and it fits in well enough, with my only complaint being that it tends to cut out just when it's getting good between cutscenes. First time playthroughs are going to land in around the 4 to 5 hour mark, with follow-ups only taking about 2 when you actually have an idea of what you're doing. Despite its flaws and being somewhat on the shorter end of LucasArts adventures, it's still a fun time with the good mostly outweighing the bad. Overall, I'd give Full Throttle Remastered a score of 4 crushed hood ornaments out of a bloody 5-finger fillet. While its fighting section is a chore, most of its puzzles don't leave you frustrated, it has a memorable story and characters, and was mostly an enjoyable experience. You can pick it up on Steam, GOG, PlayStore and Humble Bundle for about £11 a piece, and while flawed, it's still a classic adventure title that I would recommend checking out. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys later, but for now, I've got to hit the road.
When I'm on the road, I'm indestructible. No one can stop me. But they try.